5 minutes. Ms. Maloney, you talk about prior presidents using sanctions and incentives in the past, and I wouldn't dispute that point. But can you give me an example of one prior president that has, in essence, given $400 million of Iranian cash back to them, $1.3 billion of taxpayer money back to them in the form of interest, and the fact that we've unfrozen billions of dollars in assets? What other president has given that much to Iran?
President Ronald Reagan sold arms to Iran while it was in an existential war with Iraq. President George H.W. Bush provided Iran with settlements at a time where, under the very similar conditions of the U.S.
How many billions of dollars? How many billions of dollars?
Claims Tribunal.
How many billions?
Hundreds of millions of dollars in that case.
Did you say hundred of?
Intended to help to facilitate the release of American hostages and other Westerners.
Listen, don't talk over me. Hundreds of millions or hundreds of billions?
Hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of millions. So it's fair to say not to the tune of 33.6 billion. I think that's what's important to note here, the size.
I don't believe that figure is part of the transaction that is under the consideration of this hearing today.
I yielded to you for 5 minutes for your opening statement. This is my 5 minutes, and I'll ask questions, and hopefully you'll answer them, and I'll reclaim my time. But please don't talk over me. I would just ask the panel: is there any significance to the fact that this money wasn't wired or sent by way of a check, but instead was wired and then converted to cash and sent in to Iran? Is there any significance to the cash component of this, Mr. Rubin?
Very briefly, it makes it much easier to launder and much easier to use for nefarious purposes.
And why is it? Why is it easier to use cash to launder or use for nefarious purposes?
Because we often monitor bank accounts, and banks also have various structures and, in theory, transparency requirements, which make it hard to conduct terrorism or drug dealing or any other nefarious activity through the banks. That is why organized crime uses cash.
Mr. Du Bois, did you have an answer to that? You look like you were going to say something.
No, I absolutely agree. And the example I quoted in my opening testimony is we facilitated or green-lighted the transfer of $550 million by wire transfer in 2014 as part of the JPOA sanctions relief. It instantaneously hit the Central Bank of Iran's account in Switzerland, at the Central Bank of Switzerland. So the question then is, Mr. Chairman, why send $400 million in cash if, as Mr. Backermeyer said, they were seeking immediacy? They had to provide an immediate payment. That's what he said in his testimony. Well, we could have provided immediate payment by wire transferring. I mean, you've seen those films, those scenes in movies where the hostage taker's on the phone with his banker in Switzerland, and he says to him, the money's hit the account, and he says, great, and they release the hostages. So there are ways to do this, and I think the $33.6 billion is at issue in this hearing, because how did that money get repatriated to Iran? How much got repatriated to Iran? And did they send billions of dollars of cash? So we're not just talking about $1.7 billion. We may be talking about $8, $10, $15 billion of cash.
And my concern with this is that this is the lead sponsor of terrorism in the world. And frankly, if you look at successful terrorist attacks, whether in our country or other places, it's cheap. It doesn't cost a lot of money. And you look at the amount of terror that can be financed with, if we just use the $1.7 billion, it is a lot of really bad activity that can be financed with that taxpayer money. One other question I want to ask the panel. There's a dispute, and you've all heard it, was this ransom? No, I'm going to tell you, I believe if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's not a rooster. It's a duck. Some are trying to say it's a rooster. Let's leave that aside for a second, because we could debate that all day. What do you perceive the rest of the world, Iran and other rogue regimes and rogue actors, how do they, do you think, perceive what happened with this $400 million for 5 prisoners? Anyone on the panel? It
is perceived as a ransom, and we should expect that other groups are going to play look at me to try to do better than the Iranians have done once they are in need of cash as well.
Just, can anybody tell me on the panel, and even you, Ms. Maloney, that the money that's been paid, that this will not be used for terrorism or funding terrorist purposes as seen fit by the Iranian regime?
I can make no assurances about how the Iranians spend their money. What I can tell you is the long history of Iran's involvement in terrorism demonstrates no correlation between the amount of revenues available to Iran and its nefarious activity abroad.
Well, my time has expired. I'm now going to yield to the to the vice chair of this committee, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.